The heavy, polished leather of the bespoke Italian loafer struck Chandra's side before she could even gasp. She went down hard into a wooden crate of peppers, the vibrant reds and greens scattering across the dirt and cobblestone of the Namdiman market. The bustling market fell into a suffocating silence. Vendors and tourists froze, their eyes locked on the black woman in the torn dress, her hands trembling as she tried to shield herself. Chandra looked up, her vision blurring, to see the one man she had hoped to never see again. Raoul K. Heard. The man she had once called Master. The man who had discarded her like a piece of broken furniture after 3 years of abuse. Stay in the dirt where you belong, little maid, Raoul sneered, his voice dripping with the same entitlement that had once kept her in chains. He had no idea who she was now, that he had no idea that the woman he remembered. The hungry girl who cleaned his floors while he laughed at her, was dead, that he had no idea about the sleek private estate she had woken up in that morning. The heavy, platinum card tucked in her leather clutch. Or the massive, 5-carat diamond hidden beneath her grocery-stained glove. And Raoul definitely had no idea about the man who was currently watching a live feed of this market stall from the back seat of a blacked-out sedan. Because in exactly 3 minutes, when Yijun's security detail stepped onto these cobblestones, Raoul K. Heard's life was going to be systematically erased. Before we uncover how a disgraced maid became the queen of an empire, take a deep breath, because this isn't just a confrontation in a crowded market. This is a story of ultimate transformation and karmic justice. It's the story of a woman who was left for dead, only to be found and cherished by a king who doesn't believe in mercy. A story about a man who thought he could still step on the woman he once owned, only to realize he's just signed his own death warrant. This is what happens when you touch the only thing in the world a mafia boss truly loves. So make sure you are subscribed and the bell is turned on. Because the Maid is about to show her master exactly who owns whom now. The golden sunlight of the Seoul morning filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the villa, casting a warm glow over the silk sheets that felt like a far cry from the cold, damp floors Chandra had once scrubbed. She stirred as she felt the familiar, grounding weight of Yijun's hand on her waist. For a moment, she kept her eyes closed, savoring the silence of a house that didn't echo with screams or demands. Here, she wasn't a maid, a servant, or a mistake. She was the sun around which this entire dark empire revolved. Yijun leaned over, his sharp, tailored suit jacket already on, smelling of expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic scent of power. He pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender it felt like a shield being placed over her soul. "I have to handle a few matters in the city," he whispered, his voice a low rumble that always made her feel safe. "The drivers are on standby. Promise me you won't go out alone today, Chandra. The world doesn't deserve your kindness, and I don't trust it to keep you safe." She smiled, reaching up to straighten his silk tie. "I'm just going to the market, Yijun. I miss the smell of the fresh spices and the noise of the vendors. It keeps me grounded." He frowned, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. To the world, Yijun was a monster. The Ice King of the underworld who dismantled lives with a single nod. But to her, he was the man who had found her shivering in a rainstorm and spent 3 years teaching her that she was worth more than the dirt beneath her fingernails. "Then take the security detail," he insisted. "Let them carry your bags. You shouldn't have to lift a finger ever again. Just 1 hour of being normal," she pleaded softly. "I'll keep the guards at the entrance. I promise." Reluctantly, he nodded, kissing her one last time before stepping toward the door. As he walked away, his posture shifted, the softness vanished, replaced by the rigid, lethal grace of a man who ruled by fear. Chandra watched him go, looking down at the massive diamond on her finger that caught the light. She still felt the phantom weight of the apron strings she used to tie every morning, a lingering ghost of the woman Raoul K. Heard had broken. She dressed simply in a black sundress, wanting to blend into the crowd, unaware that the trauma of her past was waiting for her in the very place she went to find peace. She felt like a queen in hiding, but as she stepped into the sleek black car, she didn't realize that today, the veil would be torn away. The contrast between the villa's silk and the market's stone was about to become a battleground. The vibrant chaos of the Namdaemun market was a sensory overload that Chandra usually found therapeutic. The sharp scent of dried chilies, the rhythmic shouting of vendors, and the tactile reality of choosing the perfect produce made her feel human again, grounding the high society life she now led. She stood before a sprawling display of fresh peppers, their skins gleaming like rubies under the morning sun. For a moment, she was just a woman preparing a meal for the man she loved, the weight of her secret status tucked safely away. Then, the air seemed to thin. "You've got to be kidding me. Is that actually you?" The voice was like a jagged blade scraping against her spine. It was a tone of voice she had heard in 1,000 nightmares, the sound of her own name being spat like a curse. Chandra's hand froze mid-air, her fingers hovering over a vibrant green pepper. Her heart, which had been beating in a peaceful rhythm, suddenly hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't even have to turn around to know the owner of that voice. It was the ghost that had haunted her for 3 years, the man who had convinced her she was nothing more than the dirt on his floorboards. Slowly, she turned, her breath hitching in her throat. Raoul K. Hurd stood just a few feet away, looking every bit the arrogant aristocrat she remembered. He was draped in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than a vendor's yearly earnings, and draped on his arm was a young woman with a vacant, polished smile and a designer handbag clutched like a trophy. Raoul was clearly performing for her, his chest puffed out with the toxic bravado Chandra knew all too well. "Chandra? My God, look at you," Raoul laughed, a cold, mocking sound that drew the attention of nearby shoppers. He leaned into his companion, whispering loudly enough for the entire row of stalls to hear. "I told you about this one, darling. My former maid. I had to let her go because she was always so clumsy. And look, she's still scavenging in the dirt." Chandra felt the familiar sting of humiliation prickling her skin. The girl on Raoul's arm let out a soft, tittering giggle, looking at Chandra with a mixture of pity and disgust. Raoul stepped closer, his shadow falling over Chandra, blotting out the warm Seoul sun. He looked at her simple black dress and the grocery bag in her hand, his eyes filled with a cruel satisfaction. He saw exactly what he wanted to see, a woman who had never recovered from his abandonment. He had no way of knowing that the simple dress was pure Italian silk, or that the woman he was mocking was currently being tracked by a tactical team just 2 blocks away. To him, she was still the invisible girl from the manor, and he was still the master of her world. Raoul stepped closer, his expensive cologne clashing with the earthy aroma of the market, a scent that had once signaled the beginning of Chandra's daily torment. He looked down at her with a familiar, predatory glint in his eyes, the kind that sought out any remaining fragment of her spirit to crush. The woman on his arm looked on with bored amusement, fueling Raoul's need to perform his dominance. "You haven't changed a bit, Chandra," Raoul sneered, his voice dropping to a low, mocking hiss. "Even in a crowd, you still have that pathetic, bowed-head look of a girl who knows her place. You still look like you're waiting for someone to tell you which corner to scrub." Chandra felt a cold shiver of memory wash over her. Suddenly, she wasn't in a bustling Seoul market, she was back in his cold, cavernous manor. She could almost feel the rough texture of the scrub brush against her raw palms and hear the muffled laughter of the women Raoul would bring home while she worked in the next room. She remembered the nights she had spent polishing the very floors they walked on, her tears the only water she had to rinse away the grime of her humiliation. Raoul reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled silk handkerchief, using it to ostentatiously wipe a speck of dust from his sleeve. With a flick of his wrist, he let the fabric flutter to the dirt at Chandra's feet. It landed right next to her spilled groceries. "Be a good girl and pick that up," he commanded, his tone shifting into the sharp, effortless authority he had used to break her. "Old habits die hard, don't they? Show my guest how well I trained you. Pick it up, and maybe I'll toss you a few one for your trouble. God knows you look like you need it." The weight of the past felt like a physical hand pressing down on her shoulders. For a split second, her muscles twitched, conditioned by years of survival to obey the man who had been her world and her tormentor. She looked at the handkerchief in the mud, then back at Raoul's smug, expectant face. The silence of the market vendors seemed to amplify the heartbeat thundering in her ears. He was waiting for her to break, waiting for the maid to return to her master. But as her fingers brushed the heavy, hidden weight of the diamond ring beneath her glove, a new spark flared in the darkness of her trauma, a spark of the fire Yi Jun had spent 3 years meticulously tending. Chandra did not move. She looked at the crumpled handkerchief lying in the muck, then looked directly into Raoul's eyes. The reflexive urge to obey, the phantom weight of the maid's apron she had worn for years, finally snapped. She straightened her spine, her head high, and for the first time in his presence, she did not shrink. "Pick it up yourself, Raoul," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying a cold authority that seemed to vibrate through the humid market air. "I don't work for you anymore. I don't belong to you. And I certainly don't take orders from a man who has to bully a woman to feel powerful." The silence that followed was deafening. Raoul's face transitioned from smug amusement to a deep, mottled purple. The woman on his arm stepped back, sensing the shift in the atmosphere as his vanity was stripped bare in front of a crowd of strangers. He was a man who thrived on the perceived inferiority of others, and Chandra's defiance was a slap to his very identity. "You've forgotten your place," Raoul hissed, his voice trembling with a volatile, narcissistic rage. "You think because you're in a nice dress, you're suddenly someone. You're a servant. You're nothing." Before she could blink, Raoul lashed out. He didn't use his hand, he used the heavy, blunt force of his Italian loafer. He kicked her square in the ribs with a sickening thud. The force sent Chandra spiraling backward. She crashed into a display of wooden crates, her groceries exploding around her. Green peppers and bruised fruit rolled across the cobblestones as she hit the ground, her dress tearing against the splintered wood. A collective gasp rippled through the market. The vendors froze, their scales and ladles suspended in mid-air, their faces contorted in shock at the raw, public brutality. Chandra lay in the dirt, the wind knocked out of her, her hand clutching her side as a sharp, searing pain radiated through her chest. Raoul stood over her, breathing hard, a twisted, manic grin spreading across his face. He felt the rush of dominance return, the intoxicating high of seeing her beneath him once more. He threw his head back and laughed, a harsh, jagged sound that echoed off the stone walls of the alleyway. "Look at you," he mocked, gesturing to her crumpled form amidst the spilled produce. "Back where you started. Helpless. Pathetic. In the dirt. Did you really think you could ever be anything else?" He looked around at the horrified bystanders, expecting them to join in his mockery, but he failed to notice the shift in the perimeter. He failed to see the 3 men in razor-sharp black suits who had just rounded the corner, their eyes fixed on him with the predatory focus of wolves who had just found their target. Raoul was still laughing, unaware that his laughter was the final sound of his old life. Chandra lay in the dust of the market floor, the metallic taste of blood on her tongue and a searing heat blooming in her side where Raoul's boot had connected. The laughter of her former tormentor echoed above her, a jagged, ugly sound that should have provoked a sob. But Chandra didn't scream. She didn't beg for mercy as she once had in the shadows of the manor. Instead, she let out a slow, shuddering breath, her fingers curling with a cold, focused intent. Under the guise of clutching her bruised ribs, she slid her thumb beneath the sleeve of her dress, finding the small, haptic button on the side of her rose-gold watch. She pressed it once, twice, and then held it down. A faint, nearly imperceptible vibration hummed against her skin, a silent confirmation that the signal had been sent. 12 miles away, in the soundproofed sanctuary of a skyscraper boardroom, the air suddenly turned frigid. Yi Jun was mid-sentence, reviewing a logistics report that would determine the fate of a multi-million-dollar shipping lane, when the custom-built device on the table beside him pulsed with a violent, crimson light. He didn't need to look at the screen to know what it meant. The device was synced to Chandra's heart rate and GPS, a safeguard he had prayed he would never have to use. His eyes, usually a calm and calculating obsidian, instantly turned to ice. He watched as the biometric graph on the screen spiked, the rhythm of her heart racing into the red zone, the undeniable signature of terror or physical trauma. The high-ranking associates around the table fell into a panicked silence, sensing the sudden, lethal shift in the room's pressure. Yi Jun stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like a whetted blade. He didn't offer an explanation. He didn't issue a command. He simply looked at his head of security, who was already reaching for his radio. Namdaemun Market, Yi Jun said, his voice a low, terrifying whisper that promised 1,000 deaths. Clear the roads. If anyone stands in our way, erase them. As he strode toward the elevator, his long coat billowing behind him like the wings of a dark omen, his mind was a singular, burning focus. Someone had touched the only light in his world. Someone had dared to make her heart race with fear. By the time he reached the parking garage, his motorcade was already idling, a fleet of black steel ready to tear through the city. Back at the market, Raoul was still preening, basking in the silence of the crowd and the perceived weight of his own power. He looked down at Chandra, unaware that his countdown had already begun. He had no idea that at this very second, the most dangerous man in Seoul was carving a path through traffic with one goal in mind, the total and utter destruction of the man who had dared to touch his wife. The rhythmic sounds of the marketplace. The haggling, the chopping of knives, the distant clatter of carts, were suddenly obliterated by the synchronized scream of high-performance tires against asphalt. 3 obsidian black SUVs lurched to a halt at the market's narrow entrance, their engines idling with a low, predatory growl that seemed to vibrate the very ground beneath Chandra's bruised body. Raoul's mocking laughter died in his throat. He squinted toward the entrance, his lip curling in annoyance as he prepared to demand who had the audacity to interrupt his moment of triumph. But as the doors of the vehicles swung open in perfect unison, the annoyance in his eyes was replaced by a flickering, primal instinct of fear. 6 men in identical, razor-sharp black suits stepped out, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes scanning the perimeter with lethal efficiency. They didn't shout, they didn't have to. They simply moved into a wedge formation, creating a path through the dense crowd. Vendors scrambled backward, knocking over their own displays in a desperate bid to get out of the way. The chaotic, bustling market became a silent corridor, the crowd parting like the Red Sea before an oncoming storm. Then, Yi Jun stepped into the light. He walked with a controlled, terrifying grace, his long wool coat catching the wind like a dark shroud. His face was a mask of absolute, frozen stillness, but his eyes were fixed on the patch of dirt where Chandra lay. The air temperature in the market seemed to plummet with every step he took. He didn't look at the luxury goods, the curious tourists, or the terrified locals, he looked only at the woman in the torn dress. Raoul straightened his suit jacket, trying to regain his crumbling composure. He still didn't understand. He saw a man of immense wealth and power, but his ego refused to bridge the gap between this titan and the Maid at his feet. "Hey! This is a private matter." Raoul called out, his voice cracking slightly, betraying the terror he was trying to hide. "You can't just barge in here with." Yi Jun didn't even blink. He didn't acknowledge Raoul's existence any more than a lion acknowledges a flea. He continued his steady, relentless march toward Chandra. As he reached the edge of the spilled produce, he came to a halt. The silence was so absolute that the sound of a single pepper rolling across the cobblestone sounded like a landslide. The shadow he cast was long and cold, falling over Chandra like a protective blanket, and for the first time since the boot had struck her ribs, Chandra felt the world stop spinning. The king had arrived, and the market was now his court. Raoul stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mind struggling to reconcile the sudden arrival of this elite security detail with the woman he had just kicked into the dirt. He adjusted his silk lapels, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple despite the chill in the air. He looked at the men in black suits and then at the man in the center, the one who moved as if he owned the very oxygen in the market. Raoul's narcissistic reflex kicked in, a desperate need to reclaim his status as the master of the situation. "I don't know who you think you are," Raoul blustered, his voice high and strained, echoing awkwardly through the silent market. "But this woman was my servant. She's a thief and a liar who doesn't belong in a place like this. I was merely disciplining her for her insolence. You're clearly men of status, surely you understand the need to keep people like this in their place." Yi Jun didn't even blink. He didn't turn his head. He didn't acknowledge that Raoul had spoken at all. To Yi Jun, the man standing there was already a ghost, a smudge of insignificance that would soon be erased from existence. Instead, the most feared man in Seoul did something that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the crowd. He dropped to one knee. He didn't care about the dust staining his bespoke trousers or the spilled produce rotting on the cobblestones. His focus was singular and absolute. He reached out, his gloved hand moving with a gentleness that was reserved for only one person in the world. He took a clean, white silk handkerchief from his pocket and leaned forward, carefully dabbing at the scrape on Chandra's knee where the blood had begun to bead. "I told you the world didn't deserve your kindness, Chandra," Yi Jun whispered, his voice a low, melodic rumble that ignored the man hovering over them. He looked at the tear in her dress, his jaw tightening so hard the muscle pulsed in his cheek. "And I told you that I would never let anyone hurt you again." Chandra looked into his eyes, seeing the storm of lethal protection brewing behind the obsidian. She felt the warmth of his touch grounding her, pulling her out of the manor's shadows and back into the light of his devotion. Raoul stepped forward, his face twisting in a mix of confusion and wounded pride. "Did you hear me? I said she was a maid. You're getting your hands dirty for a woman who used to scrub my toilets." Yi Jun's hand paused. He didn't look up, but the air in the market seemed to crystallize, turning into shards of ice. "The only thing that is dirty here," Yi Jun said, his voice cold enough to stop a heart, "is the air you are still breathing." Yi Jun stood up slowly, the transition from the kneeling protector to the standing executioner sending a visible shudder through the crowd. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. The sheer weight of his presence seemed to compress the air around Raoul until the man began to gasp like a fish out of water. Yi Jun pulled a sleek, blackened smartphone from his inner pocket, his thumb gliding over the screen with a terrifying, rhythmic precision. "You speak of status," Yi Jun said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that promised a slow descent into ruin. "You speak of training. But you failed to learn the most basic lesson of survival: never touch what belongs to me." He tapped a single icon on his screen. "Erase him," he commanded into the device, then tossed it to one of his subordinates without looking back. The digital execution was instantaneous. Raoul's phone, tucked into his expensive suit jacket, began to vibrate uncontrollably. It was a frantic, staccato rhythm of alerts. First came the notification from his private bank: the accounts he had used to fund his lavish lifestyle and impress his dates were not just drained. They were liquidated, the balances dropping to zero as if they had never existed. Before Raoul could even process the loss, his phone rang. It was his primary business partner, a man Raoul had spent months courting for a multi-million-dollar development deal. Raoul answered with a trembling hand, but he didn't even get the chance to speak. "Don't ever call this number again," the voice on the other end barked, stripped of all its former professional warmth. "The contract is void. Your reputation is radioactive. If I ever see your name on a prospectus again, I'll personally ensure you're blacklisted from every exchange in Asia. You crossed a line today that doesn't have a way back." Raoul's face drained of all color, turning a sickly, translucent gray. He looked down at his phone as a flood of emails followed, his lease terminations, his membership cancellations, and a formal notice of a lawsuit for gross misconduct. In the span of 3 minutes, the big man had been reduced to a ghost. The invisible strings that Yi Jun pulled reached into every corner of Raoul's world, snapping them one by one until there was nothing left to hold him up. My money. Raoul stammered, his knees finally buckling as the reality of his total erasure set in. My life, what did you do? Yi Jun stepped forward, his shadow swallowing Raoul whole. I didn't do this to you, he whispered, leaning in so only the ruined man could hear him. Your own arrogance did. You thought she was a maid. I'm simply showing you what happens when a servant tries to strike a queen. Raoul sat in the dirt, a hollow shell of the man who had arrived at the market with such misplaced arrogance. His phone continued to chime with the digital death knells of his former life, but he no longer had the strength to look. At a slight nod from Yi Jun, two of the silent enforcers stepped forward. They didn't use unnecessary violence, they simply hauled Raoul to his feet by his expensive lapels and began dragging him toward the market exit. He didn't fight back. His eyes were wide and vacant, the realization finally sinking in that he was no longer a master, but a memory. The woman who had been on Raoul's arm slipped away into the crowd, her heels clicking frantically against the stone as she sought to distance herself from his ruin. The market vendors and shoppers watched in a stunned, reverent silence as the path cleared once again. Yi Jun turned back to Chandra, his expression softening into something so private and tender that it felt like a sanctuary. He reached out, his hand steady and warm, and waited for her to take it. Chandra looked down at the hand that had once belonged to a stranger in the rain, and then at the face of the man who had helped her rebuild her soul. She reached out, her fingers lacing firmly through his, the 5-carat diamond finally catching the full glare of the sun for all to see. She stood tall, her shoulders back, the phantom weight of the maid's apron finally dissolving into the afternoon air. As they began to walk toward the waiting motorcade, Chandra stopped. She looked back at the spilled produce, the hard-working vendors, and the women in the shadows who looked just as tired as she used to be. Yi Jun, she said softly, her voice carrying a new, unshakable weight. I don't want to just leave this place behind. I want to own it. Yi Jun paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. It is yours, Chandra. Consider it done. I want to turn it into a hub, she continued, her vision clearing. A place where women like I was, the ones the world tries to make invisible, can find work, safety, and a voice. No one will ever be kicked in the dirt here again. Yi Jun squeezed her hand, his eyes burning with pride. Then we shall call it the Valerie Center. A new reign for a new market. As they stepped into the back of the sleek black sedan, the crowd began to murmur, not in fear, but in awe. The story of the maid who became a queen would be told in these stalls for generations. Chandra leaned her head against Yi Jun's shoulder as the car pulled away, watching the market disappear in the rearview mirror. She was no longer running from her past, she was using it to pave the way for a future where she, and everyone like her, would finally be untouchable.